I learned the hard way that helping your neighbors can turn into a legal nightmare, especially when a petty tyrant gets a little bit of power. For 10 years, I'd lived in the Oak Ridge subdivision, a quiet collection of homes where people mostly kept to themselves but were friendly enough when you crossed paths. My business, a small landscaping and snow removal company, was built on reliability and a good name. I took care of half the lawns in the summer and nearly all the driveways in the winter. It was a good life, simple and straightforward. I did a good job for a fair price, and people trusted me. That trust was the foundation of everything. Our homeowners association was, for most of that decade, a joke. It was a necessary evil we paid $90 a year to, mostly to cover the landscaping for the little brick entrance sign and the insurance on the small playground nobody used. The meetings were attended by the same for retired guys who just wanted an excuse to get out of the house. They'd approve the budget, complain about gas prices, and adjourn in under 20 minutes. It was benign, ineffective, and exactly how we liked it. We were a community of individuals, not a corporate-managed collective. We looked out for each other in our own ways, without needing a binder full of rules to tell us how. Then Carol Fletcher moved in. She and her husband bought the corner lot 2 streets over, a nice 2-story brick colonial. At first, she seemed fine, if a little intense. She was the first person I'd ever seen measure the height of her neighbor's grass with a ruler. But we all have our quirks. The trouble started when one of the old guys on the HOA board passed away. Carol saw a power vacuum. She attended the next meeting, then the one after that. She talked about community standards, property values, and curb appeal. She used a lot of buzzwords that sounded good on the surface but felt like a threat underneath. Within 6 months, she had campaigned her way to becoming the HOA president, promising to whip this place into shape. The changes started small, almost laughably so. First came the email memo about trash cans. They could no longer be visible from the street, except on the evening before and the day of trash collection. A few people grumbled, but it was a minor inconvenience. Then came the rules about lawn ornaments. Only 2 decorative items were permitted, and they had to be from an approved list of styles. No more pink flamingos for the Millers, no more garden gnomes for Mrs. Gable down the street. The community was mostly apathetic. These were silly, but they weren't worth fighting over. We tolerated it, assuming her initial burst of enthusiasm would eventually fade. We were wrong. It was just the opening salvo in a war we didn't even know had been declared. That winter, the kind of blizzard that storytellers talk about for generations slammed into our state. It was a monolithic event, a solid wall of white that descended and refused to leave for 36 hours. When it finally stopped, the world was silent and buried. We had over 3 feet of snow, with drifts that piled up against doors and windows, reaching 6 or 7 feet in some places. The city plows wouldn't be reaching subdivisions like ours for days, maybe a week. We were effectively trapped. For me, this was go time. This was what I did. My livelihood was clearing away this exact kind of chaos. My first priority was always my existing clients, but in a storm like this, community came first. I fired up my big plow truck and the commercial-grade snow blower I kept on a small utility trailer. My first stop wasn't a paying customer. It was Arthur Jenkins, a man in his late 80s who lived alone and relied on a visiting nurse. I cleared his driveway and a path to his door, making sure he was all right. He waved from the window, a look of profound relief on his face. Next was Mrs. Gable, a widow whose health was fragile. Her son usually handled her shoveling, but he lived across town and was just as snowed in as we were. I cleared her place, too. I spent the entire morning just getting the most vulnerable people in our neighborhood dug out, not charging a dime. It was just the right thing to do. It was around noon, as I was finishing up the driveway of a family with a new baby, that I saw her. Carol Fletcher, bundled in a ridiculously expensive-looking ski jacket, was marching down the middle of the unplowed street, her boots sinking deep into the snow with each determined step. She had a clipboard in her hand. A clipboard. In the middle of a state of emergency. She stopped at the edge of the driveway I was clearing, her arms crossed, her face a mask of stern disapproval. I cut the engine on my snow blower, the sudden silence deafening. "Can I help you, Carol?" I asked, my breath pluming in the frigid air. She didn't bother with pleasantries. "You are in violation of Section 7, subsection B, of the Oak Ridge HOA covenants," she announced, her voice sharp and carrying in the cold. I stared at her, genuinely confused. "I'm sorry, what?" I asked. "Section 7, subsection B," she repeated, as if I were a child. "It clearly states that no commercial activity may be conducted in the subdivision between the hours of 9 post-meridium and 9 ante-meridium, or at any time on a Sunday." It was Sunday. She was trying to fine me for clearing snow for my neighbors during a blizzard because it was a Sunday. I actually laughed. It was such a preposterous notion that I couldn't help it. "Carol, look around you," I said, gesturing to the mountains of snow. "This isn't a commercial activity, this is digging people out. Arthur Jenkins needs his nurse to be able to get to him. The Patels have a newborn. I'm just helping." Her expression didn't soften. If anything, it hardened. "You are operating commercial equipment. Your truck has your company logo on it. You are performing a service for which you are normally compensated. It is a violation." A clear 1 inch. I took a deep breath, trying to hold onto my patience. "First of all, I'm not charging anyone for this. Not Arthur, not Mrs. Gable, not the Patels. Second, even if I were, this is an emergency. The city has declared it. Common sense has to apply here." She tapped her clipboard with a gloved finger. "The bylaws do not make exceptions for common sense, they make exceptions for city, state, or federal emergency services. You are not one of those. You are a private contractor." The sheer, unyielding absurdity of her position was staggering. We were standing in a winter wasteland, and she was quoting bylaws at me. "So what's your solution, Carol?" I asked, my voice edged with an irony she completely missed. "Should we all just stay trapped in our homes until Monday morning at 9? She gave a tight, superior smile. "The rules are the rules for a reason. To maintain order and standards. If we allow exceptions, the whole system breaks down." She made a note on her clipboard. "You will receive a formal warning letter for the initial violation. If you continue to operate this equipment today, you will be subject to a $100 fine. A second offense will be $250. Is that understood?" I just looked at her. The anger that had been simmering inside me started to boil. This wasn't about rules. This was about power. She was enjoying this. She was reveling in her ability to impose her will on a situation where it was not only unhelpful but actively harmful. "I understand perfectly, Carol," I said, my voice low and cold. "You understand that I'm going to finish this driveway, then I'm going to do the Millers, and then I'm going to clear a path down the center of the street so that, God forbid, an ambulance or a fire truck could actually get down here if it needed to. And you can send me whatever letters and fines you want." I turned my back on her, pulled the cord on the snow blower, and the engine roared back to life, drowning out whatever she shouted back at me. I didn't care. A line had been crossed. True to her word, the letter arrived 2 days later. It was formal, printed on HOA letterhead, citing the specific bylaw I had supposedly violated. It was a formal warning. It felt ridiculous, like a parody, but it was real. I tossed it in the trash. The next day, another letter arrived. This one was a bill. A $100 fine for continued operation of commercial equipment during restricted hours. I had, in fact, spent the rest of that Sunday and all of Monday clearing out the entire neighborhood. I'd plowed a single lane down every street so people could at least get out if they absolutely had to. It was a massive undertaking, and my reward was a fine from the woman whose own driveway I had cleared, free of charge, as a gesture of goodwill. I hadn't wanted to, but I did it because it felt petty not to. Apparently, my pettiness threshold was much higher than hers. I decided to ignore the fine. It was illegitimate, born of a ridiculous interpretation of the rules during a crisis. I assumed that once things returned to normal, she would see reason or at least be too embarrassed to pursue it. Again, I had fundamentally misjudged the depths of her vindictiveness. 2 weeks later, another envelope arrived, this time via certified mail. I had to sign for it at the post office. It contained a second fine, this one for $250, for failure to remit payment for a previous violation. It also contained a new charge, a $50 fine for the improper placement of a vehicle's apparently, my plow truck, which I had parked on the street for a few hours while I cleared a particularly nasty drift near the cul-de-sac, had violated a rule about commercial vehicles being parked on community streets for more than 2 hours. The conflict began to affect more than just me. Carol, emboldened by her newfound authority, went on a rampage. Arthur Jenkins got a warning because the small pile of snow I'd made at the end of his driveway was, according to Carol, an unapproved alteration to the landscape. Mrs. Gable received a notice that her decorative bird feeder, now visible since the snow had melted a bit, was not on the approved list of lawn ornaments. People were getting notices for things that had never been an issue in the 10 years I'd lived there. The mailman told me he'd never delivered so much certified mail to one neighborhood in his life. The community was scared. Carol had made it clear that she was not only willing to levy fines but to escalate them. The letters she sent were filled with legal-sounding jargon about liens, property rights, and collection agencies. Most people in Oak Ridge were working families or retirees on fixed incomes. They couldn't afford to fight. The path of least resistance was to pay the $50 fine for a crooked mailbox or take down the wind chime she suddenly deemed a noise violation. They would complain to me in hushed tones when I was doing their lawn, but no one was willing to confront her publicly. I was on my own. The fines against me kept accumulating. Late fees were added. Interest was compounded. The initial $100 fine had ballooned into a debt of over $700 in the span of a month. I knew I couldn't just keep ignoring it. This wasn't going to go away. She was building a case against me, brick by bureaucratic brick. The sheer pettiness was one thing, but the idea of this woman putting a lien on my house over a snowstorm was a different level of threat. It was time to stop being reactive. It was time to fight back. I realized I was out of my depth. I was a landscaper, not a lawyer. I knew how to fix a sprinkler system, not how to fight a rogue HOA. So, I sought professional counsel. I found a lawyer, a man named David Chen, who specialized in real estate and property law. He had a small, unassuming office downtown. I sat across from his desk and laid out the whole story, from the blizzard to the clipboard to the stack of threatening letters I'd brought with me. He listened patiently, nodding occasionally, a slight, unreadable smile on his face. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair. "Well," he said, "you've certainly got a classic petty tyrant on your hands. I see this more often than you'd think. An HOA board is a tiny little kingdom, and the person in charge often starts to think of themselves as a monarch." He confirmed my fears. Fighting an HOA was notoriously difficult. The covenants people sign when they buy a house are legally binding contracts. A judge would likely see this as a simple contract dispute, and the HOA's interpretation of the rules, however unreasonable, often held up in court unless you could prove they were acting in bad faith or applying the rules selectively. The bad faith angle is our best bet, David explained. But it's hard to prove. Her actions during the blizzard, however, are a strong starting point. No reasonable person would interpret the bylaws that way in an emergency. It demonstrates a vindictive, rather than a community-oriented, motive. He gave me a path forward. It wasn't going to be a direct legal assault, not at first. That would be too expensive and too slow. The strategy was to be methodical. "We need to beat her at her own game," he said. "She loves rules. So we are going to become experts on the rules." More expert than she is. David's advice was simple: stop ignoring the letters. Respond to every single one, in writing. Contest every charge. Ask for clarification. Quote other sections of the bylaws back at her. And most importantly, start digging. He told me to formally request, as was my right as a homeowner, copies of the HOA's meeting minutes for the past 2 years, the complete and current budget, and all records of expenditures. An HOA is a non-profit corporation, he said. It has to be transparent. Let's see if her books are as neat and tidy as she wants everyone's lawns to be. The investigation began. I spent my evenings, after long days of work, poring over the driest documents imaginable. The Oak Ridge HOA covenants and bylaws was a 70-page monstrosity of legalese and contradictions. I read it cover to cover, 3 times. I highlighted sections, I made notes in the margins. I started to see the holes, the vague language she had been exploiting. For instance, the rule about commercial activity she had cited against me was in a section about running a business from your home, like a daycare or a mechanic's shop. It had nothing to do with a contractor performing a service at a home. It was a willful misinterpretation. My first move was to formally appeal all the fines based on this misinterpretation. I wrote a long, detailed letter, citing the specific page and paragraph numbers, and sent it via certified mail, just as she had done with me. The response was a curt, one-sentence dismissal from the board, which consisted of Carol and 2 of her handpicked cronies, stating that their interpretation was final. It was infuriating, but David had warned me this would happen. This wasn't about winning the argument with her, it was about creating a paper trail for a potential future lawsuit. Every letter I sent, and every dismissive response she sent back, was another piece of evidence of her bad faith. Then I started digging into the financials she sent me. It was a simple spreadsheet, but something felt off. The annual dues had been $90 per household for as long as I could remember. There were 150 homes in our subdivision. That was a total annual income of $13,500. The old budget had been simple, about $10,000 for the entrance, landscaping and insurance, leaving a small surplus. But when Carol took over, she had tripled the dues to $270 a year without a full community vote, citing rising costs and the need for new community improvement projects. Suddenly, the HOA's annual income was over $40,000. Where was all that money going? According to her budget, the landscaping costs had somehow doubled, even though it was the same company that had been doing it for years. There was a new line item for administrative services that cost $5,000 a year. There was another for legal consultation at $3,000. There were thousands allocated for community events that had never materialized. It was vague and smelled fishy, but there were no smoking guns. Just a lot of suspicious-looking smoke. I knew I was missing something. The turning point came from an unexpected source. It came from Arthur Jenkins, the old man whose driveway I'd cleared first. I was over at his house one afternoon, helping him fix a loose railing on his porch. We were talking about the HOA situation, and he was angrier than I'd ever seen him. Carol had fined him $25 because his newspaper had been left on his driveway for more than 4 hours. The delivery boy threw it halfway up the walk, he said, his voice trembling with indignation. It takes me 10 minutes to get my shoes on and get out there. It's monstrous. Then he remembered something. You know, he said, tapping his temple. When this whole HOA thing started, way back when, we had to file papers with the state. A charter or something. I think I was on the first board. I might still have a copy of it in the attic. An hour later, after much searching through dusty boxes, he came down with a thin, yellowed folder. In it was the original corporate charter for the Oak Ridge Homeowners Association, filed with the Secretary of State 25 years earlier. It was the founding document, the Constitution that superseded the bylaws. I took it back to my house and read it that night. And there it was, on the 3rd page, a sentence that made my heart leap. It was under a section titled Governance and Compensation. The sentence was crystal clear: no member of the Board of Directors shall receive any salary, compensation, or financial remuneration of any kind for their services. Reimbursement for pre-approved, receipt-documented expenses related to association business is permitted. I read it again. And again. No salary. No compensation. Period. I immediately pulled up the budget Carol had sent me. I looked at that $5,000 line item for administrative services. It seemed so innocuous, so corporate. But what if it wasn't for a third-party company? What if it was for her? And what about the other 2 board members? I cross-referenced the budget with the meeting minutes. The minutes were sparse, clearly written by Carol herself. But in the minutes from the January meeting, right after she had taken power, was this line: "Motion to approve annual budget as presented." Motion seconded and passed unanimously. She had presented the budget, and her two cronies had voted for it. They had approved a budget that potentially paid them, in direct violation of the HOA's own charter. This was more than a misinterpretation of the rules. This wasn't a petty fine for a misplaced trash can. If I was right, this was fraud. This was embezzlement. This was the critical piece of leverage I needed. This discovery changed everything. I was no longer on the defensive, trying to fend off illegitimate fines. I was on the offense. I had found the rot at the core of her little empire, and I was going to expose it. My strategy shifted immediately. I called David Chen and told him what I'd found. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Well, I'll be," he said, a note of genuine excitement in his voice. "You found it. That's the silver bullet. That administrative services fee is almost certainly a self-paid salary. It's a clear breach of their fiduciary duty and a violation of their own charter." He laid out the new plan. We weren't going to sue, not yet. We were going to stage a coup. The annual community meeting was in 3 weeks. It was usually a sleepy affair, but David and I planned to make this one unforgettable. The first step was to rally the community. I spent the next 2 weeks going door to door, not with a lawnmower, but with a clipboard of my own. I didn't lead with the potential fraud. I started by listening. I let my neighbors vent their frustrations about the fines, the warnings, the constant feeling of being watched and harassed. I heard stories that made my blood boil. One family was fined because their child's bicycle was left in the driveway overnight. Another was ordered to repaint their front door because Carol had decided the shade of blue was out of harmony with the community aesthetic. After they had their say, I showed them my file. I showed them the stack of fines levied against me for helping during the blizzard. I showed them the charter Arthur had found, with the no compensation clause highlighted. And then I showed them the budget, with the triple dues and the mysterious $5,000 administrative services fee. I didn't have to connect the dots for them. They saw it immediately. The quiet grumbling turned into a low roar of anger. For the first time, my neighbors weren't scared. They were furious. I told every single one of them the same thing: come to the annual meeting. We need everyone there. The night of the meeting, the community center's small meeting room was packed. In previous years, you were lucky to get 10 people. Tonight, there were over 100. People were standing along the walls and spilling out into the hallway. The air was thick with tension. Carol and her 2 board members, a smug-looking man named Gary and a quiet woman named Linda, sat at a table at the front, looking surprised and a little nervous about the massive turnout. Carol tried to run the meeting as usual, following her rigid agenda. She droned on about the new regulations for mailbox maintenance and the success of her beautification initiative, which seemed to mostly consist of harassing people. When she opened the floor for new business, I stood up. David Chen, who was there in the capacity of a concerned friend of a resident, stood up with me. "My name is Mark," I said, my voice steady. "And I have some questions about the budget." Carol's eyes narrowed. "All budgetary questions should have been submitted in writing prior to the meeting," she said dismissively. A murmur went through the crowd. "No, they shouldn't," a voice called out from the back. It was Arthur. "The bylaws state that the annual budget must be ratified by a majority vote of the members present at the annual meeting. We are here to discuss it and vote on it." Carol was flustered. She clearly hadn't expected this. She had been ruling by decree, and the community had let her. Not anymore. "Fine," she snapped. "What is your question?" I walked to the front of the room and placed a copy of the budget and a copy of the HOA charter on the overhead projector for everyone to see. "My question," I said, pointing to the line item, "is about this $5,000 fee for administrative services. Can you tell us exactly what services this fee covers and which third-party vendor it is paid to?" A dead silence fell over the room. Carol looked at the projector, then back at me. Her face, for the first time, showed a flicker of genuine panic. That's for the extensive administrative work required to run the association, she stammered. Paperwork, filing, correspondence, her voice trailed off. I see, I said. So it's not paid to a third-party vendor? It's paid to a person? Who is that person, Carol? Gary, the man next to her, started shifting nervously in his seat. Linda looked like she wanted to be swallowed by the floor. Carol's face flushed a deep red. It's compensation for the president's duties, she finally admitted, trying to sound defiant. It's a huge amount of work. I spend at least 20 hours a week on HOA business, the room erupted. People were shouting, that's illegal, and you're paying yourself with our money. I held up a hand for quiet. According to this, I said, tapping the charter on the projector, the founding document of this HOA, which is legally binding, states, and I quote, no member of the board of directors shall receive any salary, compensation, or financial remuneration of any kind for their services. You didn't just triple our dues for community improvement, you tripled them so you could give yourself an illegal salary. The exposure was complete. Her authority, built on a foundation of intimidation and twisted rules, crumbled to dust in a matter of seconds. She started sputtering, trying to defend herself. The budget was approved. The board voted on it, she yelled over the angry crowd. David Chen stepped forward. A board cannot vote to approve an illegal act, he said, his voice calm and authoritative. Approving a budget that violates the corporate charter is an act of fraud. Taking money under those false pretenses constitutes embezzlement. The words fraud and embezzlement hung in the air. The reality of what she had done finally settled on the room. This wasn't just a violation of the rules, it was a crime. Linda, the quiet board member, burst into tears. I didn't know, she wailed. Carol said it was standard practice. She said we deserved it for all our hard work. Carol shot her a look of pure venom, but it was too late. The dam had broken. The rest of the meeting was a blur of righteous fury. A motion was made from the floor to remove all 3 board members, effective immediately. It passed with a unanimous roar of aye. Another motion was made to elect a temporary board, with Arthur Jenkins stepping up as the interim president. That also passed unanimously. A third motion was passed to freeze all HOA bank accounts and submit the financials and meeting minutes to the district attorney's office for a formal investigation. Carol Fletcher sat there, white-faced and silent, as the community she had tried to rule with an iron fist dismantled her kingdom piece by piece. When the meeting was finally adjourned, she and Gary scurried out of the room, avoiding the furious glares of their neighbors. The aftermath was swift and decisive. The district attorney's office launched an investigation, and what they found was even worse than I had suspected. Carol hadn't just given herself a salary. She had been using the HOA debit card for personal expenses, gas, groceries, even a few expensive dinners she'd classified as board meetings. The legal consultation fee was for a retainer with a law firm to send threatening letters to residents. The landscaping costs had been inflated with fake invoices from a friend's company, with Carol getting a kickback. In total, she had misappropriated over $15,000 in less than a year. Formal charges were filed. Carol Fletcher was charged with multiple counts of theft, fraud, and embezzlement. Gary, her main crony, was charged as an accessory. Linda, who cooperated fully with the investigation, was given immunity in exchange for her testimony. The legal process took almost a year, but in the end, justice was served. Carol was convicted on all counts. Given the breach of trust and the number of victims, every single homeowner in the subdivision, the judge was not lenient. She was sentenced to 18 months in state prison and ordered to pay full financial restitution to the HOA. With Carol gone, a sense of peace and relief settled over Oak Ridge. The first act of the new board, led by Arthur, was to nullify every single fine and warning issued during Carol's reign of terror. My own debt of over $700 was wiped from the books with a formal letter of apology from the new board on behalf of the entire community. The illegal lien that she had threatened to place on my property was, of course, never filed. My reputation was more than restored. I was seen as a kind of local hero, the guy who stood up to the bully when no one else would. My business, ironically, boomed. People I'd never worked for before hired me, telling me they wanted to support the guy who fought for the neighborhood. The community reformed itself from the ground up. We held a special meeting to completely rewrite the bylaws. We kept the necessary rules, the ones that genuinely protected property values, and threw out all the petty, controlling nonsense. We capped annual dues at $100, and we put in a clause that any increase of more than 10% would require a 2/3 vote of the entire community, not just the board. We made transparency the new law of the land. The HOA went back to being what it was supposed to be, a boring, barely noticeable entity that handled the basics and left people alone. The neighborhood returned to a state of quiet cooperation, but it was better than before. We had been through a fire together, and it had forged a new sense of solidarity. We weren't just a collection of houses anymore, we were a community. Several years have passed since then. The neighborhood is thriving. Property values are up, not because of draconian rules, but because it's a genuinely pleasant and friendly place to live. The HOA is run by reasonable people who see their role as serving the community, not ruling it. The playground that nobody used to use is now often filled with the laughter of children from new families that have moved in. We have a neighborhood barbecue every summer, a tradition we started the year after Carol left. I saw her once, about a year after she was released from prison. I was loading equipment onto my trailer when a beat-up old car I didn't recognize pulled up. She was in the passenger seat. Her husband was driving. She looked diminished. The fiery self-righteousness was gone, replaced by a hollow, defeated look. Her hair was grey, and she'd lost a lot of weight. She rolled down the window as they drove slowly past. She didn't say anything at first, just looked at me. Then, in a voice so quiet I could barely hear it, she said, "I'm sorry." I just nodded. There was nothing else to say. I didn't feel anger anymore, just a kind of detached pity for a person who had ruined her own life in a desperate quest for control. They drove away, and I never saw her again. I heard they moved to another state to start over. The whole ordeal taught me a valuable lesson. It taught me that the abuse of power, even on the smallest scale, can cause real harm. A homeowners association, a town council, any little fiefdom, they can become toxic when the wrong person is in charge, when rules become more important than people, and when control becomes an end in itself. But it also taught me something more important. It taught me that one person, armed with the truth and a little bit of courage, can make a difference. It taught me that a community is stronger than a tyrant, and that when good neighbors stand together, there's no petty dictator they can't overthrow. Now, when the snow falls, I still fire up my plow. I still clear the driveways for Arthur and Mrs. Gable first. I still do a pass down the middle of the street, making sure everyone is safe. The only difference is that now, instead of threatening letters, I sometimes find a hot thermos of coffee or a plate of warm cookies waiting for me on my doorstep when I get home. And that, I've come to realize, is what a real community is all about. It's not about rules and fines. It's about looking out for one another, freely and without coercion. It's a peace I worked hard to win back for all of us, and it's a peace I will never again take for granted.